Hello, my name is Kay Dickerson, and I'm Director of the U.S. Cochrane Center. Welcome to FDA and the Regulation of Healthcare Interventions, a supplemental module for understanding evidence-based healthcare, a foundation for action. You may view this module without completing our foundational online course, Understanding Evidence-Based Healthcare, but we urge you to enroll in both courses to enrich your knowledge base and enhance your understanding of the material in this module. Most of you already know Musamair well from Understanding Evidence-Based Healthcare, our foundational course. It turns out a lot of people know her. When I'm out and about, I'll frequently run into people who have taken this course and who will ask me to send Musa their regards or ask me to send her their thanks for such a wonderful introduction to evidence-based healthcare. We got lucky. Musamair agreed to serve as the primary developer and the instructor for a new module on the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Musa has extensive experience with FDA decision-making, which she brings to this course and to the examples she provides. Musa is a nationally recognized patient advocate, as well as a writer and online course developer. She brings her in-depth experience and knowledge to this module on the FDA, in addition to her long service on FDA advisory boards. The demand for Musa as a participant in health and healthcare activities is testament to the respect that scientists, physicians, policymakers, and other consumers and patients have for Musa's work and her many contributions. We are so very pleased and honored that Musa agreed to work on our new module on the FDA and regulation of healthcare interventions. Without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce the instructor and co-developer of this course, Musamair.
Hello again. This is Musamair with a new module for our web course, Understanding Evidence-Based Healthcare, a Foundation for Action. Because the safety and efficacy of treatments matter to patients, and what matters to patients matters to advocates, we've chosen to focus this new module on the Food and Drug Administration, the principal regulatory body for medical products here in the United States. In 2001, I was a brand new patient representative, feeling both privileged and intimidated as I sat for the first time as a voting member of an advisory committee convened by the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA. Since that time, I've served on several of the 49 committees and panels that advise the FDA on matters of science, policy, and technical issues. In these public meetings, consumer and patient representatives join the expert physicians, scientists, and statisticians around the table to advise the FDA on whether or not a drug should be approved or a policy or approach for evaluating evidence upheld. The FDA is an important arbiter of public health, making sure that the drugs and other medical products on the market are as safe and effective as existing evidence and resources permit, and that we understand clearly what these products are and how to use them. This is no simple task, and a great deal is at stake. Industry investment in drug development is huge, but so are the potential returns when a new product is successful. Preserving the public health is a central part of FDA's mission, but maintaining public trust in the regulatory process is often a challenge. As in the rest of our course, in this module, we'll discuss a number of key concepts. We'll be looking at how medical products are regulated, with a focus on drugs and biologics as areas of greatest interest. After a history of regulation in the United States and the laws that govern the regulation of medical products, we'll examine the role, scope, and function of the FDA. Myths and misunderstandings about the FDA are widespread, so we'll be taking a look at how the regulatory process actually works. In the process, we'll cover some common terms and processes of drug development and regulatory law, touching on some of the controversies and tensions that are an inherent part of drug regulation. We'll examine the FDA's role in safeguarding the public, both before and after products are marketed, and the limitations of current methods for gathering safety data, especially post-marketing. We'll see what kinds of future initiatives might help to prevent some of the problems that so frequently come to light. Using examples, we'll look at clinical trial endpoints, FDA's term for outcomes, as the way to know if a new drug actually works, and go into some specific limitations encountered in cancer research. We'll examine the role that the FDA plays in determining when evidence of clinical benefit is sufficient and how to weigh clinical benefits against the risks or harms of a given treatment. We'll examine an issue of much concern to those with life-threatening diseases: how to gain the earliest access to promising new treatments. Accelerated approval and expanded access are ways in which the FDA facilitates this process. Finally, we'll look at the growing issue of off-label marketing and drug use. In our real-world examples, we'll review some of the public health catastrophes that have led to the legislation that permits the FDA to play the role that it does today. We'll also tell a story about Avastin, a biological drug approved for the treatment of several kinds of cancer, that will illuminate many of the complex issues and dynamics that are part of drug development and regulation. In this section, we'll offer a brief history of some of the early landmarks in drug development regulation. The perception that some form of regulation could protect consumers from the catastrophic excesses of free enterprise dates back to the early 19th century, when many states passed food and drug laws against what they called purveyors of deceitful goods. Adulteration and misbranding of food and drugs were common then. By mid-19th century, science was able to detect the ingredients of these substances, making legislation possible. The Import Drug Act of 1848 provided for the inspection, detention, and destruction or re-exportation of imported drug shipments that failed to meet United States standards. This law was passed after it was discovered that U.S. troops in the Mexican War had been given substandard drugs. In 1862, under the Department of Agriculture, President Lincoln appointed the first head of the Division of Chemistry, later the Bureau of Chemistry, the precursor of the FDA. The next 40 years saw increasing official concern about animal diseases and pressure for legislation to control the meatpacking industry. But the turning point came when the writer Upton Sinclair popularized abuses in the Chicago meatpacking industry in his 1906 novel The Jungle, leading to a public outcry for a safe food supply. Pressure on Congress led in 6 months' time to the passage of the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, which established the Bureau of Chemistry that would become the Food and Drug Administration in 1930. At this time, the use of various remedies and potions was widespread and completely unregulated. People had no protection from snake oil salesmen and their ilk. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 required that drugs not be mislabeled or adulterated. Drugs had to meet recognized standards for strength and purity and must contain what they claimed to contain. In 1912, the Shirley Amendment to the Act prohibited false therapeutic claims for drugs. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938 was enacted after 107 people, many of them children, died from taking elixir sulfanilamide, an antibacterial formula used to treat streptococcal infections. The manufacturer had reformulated the drug in liquid form using diethylene glycol, a solvent used in making antifreeze, but had failed to test it for toxicity. At the time, no law required toxicity studies for new drugs, and there were no legal consequences. These unfortunate occurrences may be expected to continue, said the FDA Commissioner Walter Campbell, because new and relatively untried drug preparations are being manufactured almost daily, at the whim of the individual manufacturer, and the damage to public health cannot accurately be estimated. The only remedy for such a situation is the enactment by Congress of an adequate and comprehensive National Food and Drugs Act, which will require that all medicines placed on the market shall be safe to use under the directions for use. The sulfanilamide incident, the worst of several during those years, was enough to break the deadlock in Congress and get new legislation passed, giving the FDA unprecedented control over medical products. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938 stipulated the safety of drugs when used in accordance with the labeled instructions. New drugs had to be submitted to the FDA prior to marketing and proven safe through testing in animals and people. In 1951, the Durham-Humphrey Amendment divided drugs into two categories: drugs that could be safely self-administered, known as over-the-counter, and prescription drugs that required medical supervision. It also required this cautionary statement on all prescription drug labels: federal law prohibits dispensing without a prescription. A breakthrough for the oversight and regulation of drug safety came in 1962 when the FDA medical officer Francis O. Kelsey, relying on 1938 law, refused FDA approval for a new sedative widely used in Europe to treat morning sickness during pregnancy. Thalidomide ultimately led to the birth of thousands of babies with malformations. Dr. Kelsey's action demonstrated the need for legislation to further strengthen the existing law. In the 1962 Kefauver-Harris Amendment, it was acknowledged that no drug could be shown to be safe until its efficacy was also demonstrated. Risks and benefits were to be weighed together, and efficacy for a particular use must be proven prior to marketing. Challenged by the drug industry, this legislation was later upheld by the Supreme Court. The photograph here shows Dr. Kelsey being honored by President Kennedy for her role in protecting the United States from the thalidomide tragedy. In the more recent history of the FDA, commissioners and other agency personnel have rarely been praised publicly or thanked for their actions. These days, the Food and Drug Administration is frequently blamed for both safety issues and delays in approving new drugs. Clearly, these two issues are related. Public response seems predictable. Either the public believes the agency doesn't insist on enough testing, leading to safety issues, or the public believes FDA insists on too much testing, leading to delayed access. Getting the balance right is challenging. In more recent years, the AIDS epidemic brought significant regulatory changes as a direct result of public concerns. In the late 1980s, AIDS activists fought for earlier drug access and approvals. It was a time when tens of thousands of dying AIDS patients lacked effective treatments, even as science was just beginning to make strides against this then fatal disease. Drugs into Bodies was the rallying cry of ACT UP, the AIDS coalition to unleash power. The FDA became a prime focus of activism. Many of us who live in daily terror of the AIDS epidemic cannot understand why the Food and Drug Administration has been so intransigent in the face of this monstrous tidal wave of death, wrote Larry Kramer in an opinion piece published in the New York Times. There is no question on the part of anyone fighting AIDS that the FDA constitutes the single most incomprehensible bottleneck in American bureaucratic history. A parallel track was proposed that would allow the early distribution of AIDS drugs to large numbers of patients, in parallel with the conventional clinical trials that assessed the drug's safety and efficacy. A treatment IND, or investigational new drug, often referred to as compassionate use, was and is an FDA mechanism whereby individual patients who were ineligible for clinical trials might gain access to a drug undergoing development with the help of a willing physician and the consent of the drug company. Expanded access programs offered more equitable access for many patients, not just the privileged or knowledgeable few, ultimately giving more than 80,000 AIDS patients access to the first 11 AIDS drugs between 1986 and 1995. But by the mid-1990s came a shift in perspective away from drugs into bodies towards the promotion of good science, wrote Stephen Epstein in his book Impure Science, AIDS Activism, and the Politics of Knowledge. Epstein quotes an AIDS activist who says that many, like him, believed that through their activism they were going to be able to save their lives. Strategies, therefore, were based significantly on the desire to get something, anything, through the pipeline to get drugs into bodies fast enough to matter for the health of the current generation of activists. The activist continued, "Now my personal belief is, no, I'm not going to be able to save my life." In the ongoing tension between access and answers, activist strategy had moved toward the opposite pole. Quote, "It's about having good science that develops good therapies so that we may have a cure or therapy someday." Recognizing the importance of trial recruitment to finding new treatments for AIDS, many advocacy organizations created regularly updated registries of ongoing trials. In 1988, the HOPE Act established ACTIS, the AIDS Clinical Trials Information Service. By law, information about ongoing AIDS clinical trials had to be made public. This, in addition to other existing federal trials registers, paved the way for the legislation that ultimately led to mandatory online listing at clinicaltrials.gov. In response to demands for faster approval of new drugs, a new section called Accelerated Approval was added to the Code of Federal Regulations that governs food and drugs within the FDA. The following provisions for the U.S. regulations on accelerated approval continue to have a significant impact in drug development today. According to the language in the regulation, accelerated approval applies only to treatments for serious or life-threatening illnesses that provide meaningful therapeutic benefit to patients over existing treatments on the basis of adequate and well-controlled clinical trials establishing that the drug product has an effect on a surrogate endpoint that is reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit, or on the basis of an effect on a clinical endpoint other than survival or irreversible morbidity. Approval, continues the regulation, will be subject to the requirement that the applicant study the drug further to verify and describe its clinical benefit, where there is uncertainty as to the relation of the surrogate endpoint to clinical benefit or of the observed clinical benefit to ultimate outcome. Post-marketing studies would usually be studies already underway. When required to be conducted, such studies must also be adequate and well-controlled. The applicant shall carry out such studies with due diligence. The legislation further sets out a process whereby the FDA may withdraw approval if the drug's benefit is not confirmed or studies are not carried out with due diligence. As in all other drug approvals, accelerated approval always refers to a specific use of the drug. The process for drug approval at the FDA involves review of data by highly trained staff from clinical trials submitted to the agency. Prior to 1992, the review process was paid for by the U.S. government and this limited the funds available for staffing at the FDA, leading to review times that were deemed unacceptable to the public. This changed when 1992 legislation, the Prescription Drugs User Fee Act, or PDUFA, required drug companies to pay the FDA a substantial fee for the review of their products. This added to the FDA budget and enabled the FDA to hire additional review staff and shorten what had been a lengthy review process. Without compromising quality, 18 months or more was shortened to its current level of 10 months, with priority review times of 6 months or in some cases less. Although care has been taken to insulate the payment the companies make from the internal workings of FDA, there has been some concern over the years since then that having the industry pay for drug review promotes too close a relationship and may encourage overly favorable review of new drugs. Paying for expedited reviews with taxpayer dollars, however, has not been acceptable to Congress or to the public, and reverting to longer review times in a time when biomedical research is thriving is even less acceptable. As with many other industries, the pharmaceutical business is truly international, with worldwide markets and testing of its products. Harmonization refers to efforts between countries to establish a common method for regulatory approval and oversight of new drug approvals, and ensuring the quality, safety, and efficacy of drugs. In 1990, the International Conference of Harmonization, or ICH, was formed. In the 20 years since, there has been significant progress in cooperation between the U.S., the European Union, and Japan, who have established agencies similar to the FDA. According to ICH, key benefits of harmonization are preventing duplication of clinical trials in humans and minimizing the use of animal testing without compromising safety and effectiveness, streamlining the regulatory assessment process for new drug applications, and reducing the development times and resources for drug development. Other refinements of FDA processes and products have occurred in recent years. In 1997, the FDA Modernization Act, known as FDAMA, was passed. Among many other provisions, this comprehensive bill regulates the promotion of off-label uses and health claims for food and dietary supplements. In 1999, ClinicalTrials.gov, a national publicly accessible database for clinical trials, was implemented under FDAMA, and registration of all Phase 2 and 3 trials of drugs undergoing development was mandated. In 2007, the FDA Amendments Act, referred to as FDA, gave the FDA broad new regulatory authorities, particularly with regard to drug safety. So we're going to talk about it in some detail. Since the 1990s, there had been a series of very public safety scandals involving recently marketed drugs. Safety issues had suffered from the lack of resources and attention by comparison with new drug reviews. In 2005, the Drug Safety Oversight Board was established at FDA to oversee monthly the communication and management of risk related to specific concerns about drugs whose safety has been questioned. The new law also provided for modernization and electronic surveillance of post-marketing safety of drugs. This had been accomplished through AIRS, the Adverse Event Reporting System, which relies on physicians and patients to report side effects of approved drugs. It's widely believed that this passive system grossly underreports the kind of side effects once new drugs enter the broader patient population. It has been suggested that continuous monitoring through electronic medical records might permit immediate identification of serious side effects. FDA also reauthorized what is called REMS, risk evaluation and mitigation strategies for marketed drugs. REMS offer specific instructions for safe use of drugs with known serious side effects. Finally, FDA expanded the legal requirement for trial registration in the U.S. and created penalties for non-compliers. The legislation also mandated the dissemination of some clinical trials results and adverse events via clinicaltrials.gov. This database has become increasingly comprehensive, both because of FDA and because there was important help from medical journals editors who refused to publish unregistered trials. FDA also reauthorized PDUFA, the Prescription Drug User Fee Act. By 2007, money contributed by industry made up 25% of the entire FDA budget. A user fee for the review of medical devices was also established. Under FDA, testing of drugs in children, a long-neglected area, was addressed. A new fee system was put in place to pay for the review of direct-to-consumer advertising, banned in all but one other country in the world, to ensure it is truthful in its claims. ClinicalTrials.gov, the publicly accessible database in which all Phase 2 and 3 drug development trials must be registered, was now to include emerging safety issues and clinical trial results.